Betrayal Hub. Subscribe. Subscribe to this channel for carefully told stories about relationships and personal change. The night she said it, she didn't raise her voice. That was the part that stuck. We were standing near the bar at a rooftop fundraiser, glass walls, city lights, people who like to be seen more than they like to listen. She leaned slightly toward her friends, not toward me, and said she decided who she spent time with. She added that I didn't get a say in her life anymore. Her tone was clean, almost professional, like a press release. I nodded once. I didn't smile. I didn't argue. I didn't step closer. I just agreed. That wasn't the reaction she wanted. Her friends watched me the way people watch a quiet dog, waiting to see if it will suddenly bite. Someone laughed too loud. Someone else pretended to check their phone. My wife, Laura, held her glass still, eyes flicking to my face, searching for heat. There wasn't any. I told her she was right, and stepped back to make room for someone else to stand where I had been. Earlier that evening, she had arrived without me. That alone had drawn looks. I was usually the one holding coats, managing the exits, knowing when to leave before the room turned sour. That night, I came later, alone, after finishing a site call about a delayed infrastructure permit. Concrete, load limits, drainage, things that didn't clap for you, but held when tested. Laura had already settled into her circle. Bright clothes, bright smiles. Among them was Evan. Loud laugh. Expensive watch that wanted attention. He talked with his hands and with his confidence, pitching his latest venture to anyone who didn't move fast enough. I had met him before. I had told Laura exactly what I thought. She had smiled then too. When I stepped away from the bar, I didn't leave the event. I moved to the edge, where the glass met the dark. From there, I could see her relax. She filled the space I'd left immediately. Evan slid closer. A hand landed at her lower back and stayed there longer than it needed to. No one stopped it. No one looked uncomfortable. That was the point. I took out my phone and scrolled past notifications without opening them. Photos were being taken. Tags would follow. By morning, the story would be public enough to feel permanent. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions. I stayed long enough for it to be clear I wasn't storming out. Then I left quietly, the way I leave job sites when the plan changes and no one notices until the work stops getting done. The first call came the next morning, not from Laura, but from my sister. She didn't ask questions. She said she'd heard I left early. Her voice stayed neutral, the way people speak when they already know something but want to see if you'll correct it. I told her everything was fine and ended the call before she could soften it with concern. At work, nothing shifted on the surface. Meetings still ran long. Drawings still needed approvals. Contractors still blamed weather for their mistakes. I kept my hands busy and my calendar full. Around noon, one of the younger project managers mentioned a post he'd seen from the fundraiser. He didn't say my wife's name. He didn't need to. He glanced at me once, then stared hard at his screen, as if numbers might save him from embarrassment. I didn't ask what he saw. That afternoon, a message came through from Laura's assistant. Not Laura herself. The assistant asked whether I'd still be attending an upcoming launch event with her. The phrasing mattered. Still, attending. With her. I replied that my schedule had changed and left it at that. No explanation. No apology. The assistant reacted quickly, a digital red receipt followed by silence. By evening, Laura finally called. I watched the phone light up and let it stop on its own. A few minutes later, a text followed, casual on the surface, edged underneath. She wrote that we needed to talk about what I'd done the night before. Not what she'd said. Not what she'd allowed. What I'd done. I didn't respond. Instead, I went home and moved through the house the way I always had, except with intent. I took my clothes out of the shared closet and into the spare room. I logged into our joint accounts and separated what had always been neatly combined. Bills reassigned. Subscriptions canceled. Nothing dramatic. Just clean lines where there had been blur. Later, through the living room window, I saw headlights pull in. Laura came inside carrying the confidence she used in public, but it slipped when she saw the empty side of the closet. She stood there longer than necessary, phone in hand, thumb hovering. She didn't knock on the spare room door. That night, she posted again. A photo from dinner, Evan across the table, his hand visible this time, resting where mine used to be. The caption talked about freedom and choosing yourself. I didn't block her. I didn't mute her. I just stopped standing where she expected to find me. The evidence didn't arrive all at once. It drifted in through other people, the way smoke slips under a closed door. A colleague forwarded me an invite I hadn't received, a private after-party tied to one of Laura's campaigns. My name was absent. Evan's wasn't. Later, a neighbor mentioned seeing her car parked overnight in a building across town, said it casually, as if pointing out a weather change. I nodded and carried groceries inside without correcting him. At work, I pulled access logs for a transit project I designed years earlier. It had nothing to do with Laura, but the habit carried over. Verify. Cross-check. Don't assume. By evening, that discipline shifted direction. A shared calendar entry disappeared. A rideshare receipt hit the joint email, late and flagged as business. It wasn't. I archived it without comment. I stopped appearing where she expected me to be. When her parents visited the city, I scheduled a site inspection outside town. I sent a brief message to her mother saying schedules were separate now. The reply came quickly, polite, and confused. I didn't clarify. Confusion spreads faster when no one rushes to explain. Laura began adjusting. She showed up earlier to the house, left later, changed outfits twice before going out. The house filled with motion and noise, but nothing landed. One evening, she stood in the kitchen scrolling through her phone, pausing on a photo she hadn't posted. Evan's face hovered near hers. She deleted it, then put the phone down harder than necessary. I stayed in the spare room with the door open, not hiding, not inviting. When she passed by, she slowed, waiting for me to look up. I didn't. I was reading through municipal notes, pen moving steadily, the way it does when something has to hold. The next day, my name disappeared from a seating chart at one of her client dinners. The organizer emailed to apologize, said Laura had updated preferences. I replied with thanks and forwarded it to my sister without comment. She understood the message without needing words. That night, Laura came home alone. No laughter followed her. No heels on the floor behind her. She moved through the house checking lights, doors, corners, as if something might still be where she left it. When she reached the spare room, she stopped in the doorway. She said we needed to talk about boundaries. She said she hadn't meant for things to look a certain way. I didn't answer. I kept writing until she stepped back on her own. Later, another receipt arrived. Hotel. Downtown. 2 names. Only one matched ours. I saved it, not as proof, but as a marker. The line had been crossed loudly. I didn't need to raise my voice to hear it. The disappearance wasn't dramatic. There were no slammed doors or packed suitcases in the hallway. I didn't leave town. I didn't warn her. I simply stopped being reachable. One morning, I woke early, showered, dressed, and left the house without waking Laura. I went to work like any other day, parked in the same garage, walked past the same security desk. By lunchtime, I'd forwarded my calls to voicemail and silenced notifications. Not blocked, just quieted. There's a difference people don't notice until they need you. By mid-afternoon, the messages started stacking up. First practical, then irritated, then oddly polite. She asked where I was, whether I'd be home, if we could sync schedules. I watched them arrive without opening any. The phone stayed face down on my desk, vibrating against the wood like something trapped. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I stayed at a short-term apartment I'd used before during long projects. Neutral furniture. No photos. No shared history in the corners. I ordered dinner, ate it standing, and slept without setting an alarm. The silence was clean. It didn't ask anything from me. The next morning, Laura escalated. She called my assistant. She called my sister. She left a message with my office manager, framed as concern. People began comparing notes. The story didn't add up the way she needed it to. I was still working, still answering emails, still present everywhere that mattered, just not where she expected me to perform the role she'd assigned. By evening, she showed up at my office building. Security called to ask if she was expected. I said no and thanked them for checking. She waited in the lobby for nearly an hour. I watched through the glass from an upper floor, her posture shifting as confidence drained into irritation, then something tighter. When she finally left, she didn't look back. That night, she posted again. A vague caption about strength and choosing peace. The comments filled fast. Supportive, curious, confused. Evan appeared in one reply, joking, too familiar. It landed wrong. People noticed. I stayed where I was. The next day, the joint credit card stopped working for her expenses. Not canceled, just capped. Utilities transferred quietly. Streaming services logged out. Small inconveniences, spaced apart, like pressure applied evenly instead of all at once. She sent one final message that evening, longer than the rest. She said disappearing like this wasn't fair. She said adults talk things through. I read it. I didn't answer. I wasn't disappearing from life. I was disappearing from her control. Evan unraveled without my involvement, which was the cleanest part. All I did was stop absorbing the noise he created and let gravity do the rest. His name started appearing where it didn't belong. A city vendor meeting agenda included him as a partner, though no one could explain in what capacity. A permitting office flagged one of his companies for incomplete filings. Nothing dramatic, just questions that didn't go away. I recognized the pattern immediately. I'd seen it on projects where confidence ran ahead of structure. Eventually, someone asked for documentation. Laura heard about it before I did. She came to the apartment one evening unannounced, hair perfect, voice tight. She said Evan was under stress. She said people were misinterpreting things. She said it would blow over. She spoke like a publicist managing a narrative that no longer listened. I didn't correct her. I didn't offer reassurance. I stayed seated, laptop open, attention fixed elsewhere. When she realized she wasn't being pulled into the story, she slowed. Her hand stopped moving. She waited for me to take a side. I didn't. Over the next few days, the tone around Evan shifted. Invitations thinned. A launch party was postponed, then quietly canceled. One of Laura's friends stopped tagging him altogether. Another deleted a photo after someone commented with a question mark. These weren't attacks. They were pauses. In her world, pauses were dangerous. Laura's phone became heavier in her hand. She checked it constantly, eyes scanning for validation that arrived late or not at all. When Evan did call, it was brief. His voice, once booming, sounded clipped, defensive. She paced during those calls, lowering her volume, glancing at me as if my presence alone might be influencing the outcome. I remained exactly where I was. At work, someone forwarded me a compliance notice tied to one of Evan's ventures, asking if I'd heard anything. I replied that I hadn't and returned to reviewing load calculations. The building would either stand or it wouldn't. Feelings didn't factor in. That weekend, Laura attended an event alone. She came back earlier than usual. Her heels sounded uneven on the floor. She sat at the kitchen counter scrolling, stopping, scrolling again. She didn't look up when I passed behind her. She waited for me to say something that would anchor her. I didn't. Later, she posted a photo without a caption. Just her face, carefully lit, searching for an echo. The comments were polite. Fewer hearts. Evan didn't appear at all. I watched from a distance I hadn't planned, but didn't resist. Structures fail when pressure reveals what was never reinforced. I hadn't pushed. I'd simply stopped holding things together that were never mine to carry. The shift became visible in public before it was ever addressed in private. Laura's world ran on rooms, not conversations, and rooms had started closing. A charity dinner she normally anchored released its seating plan without her name. Another event moved venues and forgot to notify her. These weren't snubs anyone could point to. They were omissions, the kind that left no one to confront. When she asked around, answers came back delayed and overly polite. People said things were fluid. People said decisions were above their pay grade. At a family gathering, her cousin mentioned seeing me alone at a work function and asked if everything was okay. The question wasn't concerned. It was observational. Laura laughed it off too quickly and reached for her drink. Her mother watched without intervening, eyes narrowing slightly, as if recalculating something she'd previously taken for granted. I stayed neutral and present. I showed up to events I was invited to. I didn't accompany her to any. When people asked where Laura was, I said she had her own commitments. The phrasing spread. Each person repeated it with a slight variation until it became accepted language. Her friends noticed first. One by one, they stopped calling her with last-minute plans. Group chats went quiet when she joined. Photos were taken at angles that left her half out of frame. No one explained. They didn't need to. The room had decided. At one industry mixer, I arrived early and spoke briefly with a board member I'd known for years. When Laura arrived later, alone, the same person greeted her with a nod instead of the usual embrace. She felt it immediately. She stood straighter, smiled harder, scanned for Evan. He wasn't there. Someone mentioned my name near the bar, not to me. They said it casually, with respect, as if confirming a detail. Laura turned too fast, eyes locking onto my back. I didn't turn around. When she finally approached, she slowed, unsure of the rules. She said we needed to stop making things awkward for people. I looked at her, calm, and said nothing. That silence did more than any argument could have. She searched my face for anger, for accusation, for something she could push against. There was nothing. Around us, the conversation flowed without adjusting for her discomfort. She stood there, present but unsupported. Later that night, she left early. I stayed until the end, shaking hands, finishing conversations. As I walked out, I saw her in the parking lot sitting in her car, phone pressed to her ear, voice low, urgent. Whoever she was calling didn't answer right away. The social current had shifted. She could feel it pulling away from her ankles. And for the first time, she realized it wasn't following her anymore. Isolation didn't arrive with silence. It arrived with noise that no longer responded. Laura filled the house again, moving from room to room, making calls that went unanswered or ended too quickly. She spoke louder than necessary, as if volume might pull people back into range. I stayed visible but uninvolved, present in the mornings, gone in the evenings, my routines intact and separate. The house adjusted around that fact without ceremony. She tried proximity next. She lingered near the spare room, left doors open, cooked meals she knew I used to like. Plates appeared on the counter without being offered. When I didn't touch them, they were cleared away later, untouched, as if evidence needed to be removed. Her phone rarely left her hand. Notifications slowed. When they came, her face tightened instead of lighting up. She stopped posting for a while. Then she posted too much. Neither worked. Evan's name disappeared from her mouth entirely, not replaced by anything else. Absence became the subject. One afternoon, I came home to find her sitting on the floor of the living room, back against the couch, shoes still on. She looked up as I entered, eyes searching, measuring. She said she felt like everyone had stepped back at once. She said she didn't understand how it happened so quickly. I set my bag down and went to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water and drank it standing up. When I returned, she was still there, waiting for me to contradict her reality, to offer a version where she wasn't alone. I didn't. The following weekend, she went out and came back early again. No laughter followed her through the door. She sat at the table scrolling through old photos, stopping on ones where I stood beside her, steady and unremarkable. She zoomed in on my face in one, then put the phone down face first. I started receiving invitations addressed only to me. Conferences. Dinners. A long-term project review dinner she would have hosted last year. I accepted a few and declined others, not to send a message, but because I no longer filtered my life through hers. She noticed the change immediately. She asked where I was going, who I'd be with, whether it was necessary. I answered simply, without elaboration. Each response ended the conversation instead of extending it. At night, the house went quiet in a way it never had before. No calls, no pacing, just the sound of her moving restlessly behind a closed door. I stayed where I was, steady, unresponsive, no longer the surface she could lean against. For the first time, she wasn't being ignored. She was being left alone. She chose a quiet evening for the confrontation, the kind that used to mean resolution. No guests, no phones buzzing, just the house and the space between us that had grown deliberate. I was at the table reviewing documents when she sat across from me. She didn't touch anything. She didn't pace. She kept her hands folded, as if restraint might earn her something. Her voice stayed even, practiced. She said she needed clarity. She said the distance was confusing. She said she didn't know what I wanted anymore. I closed the folder and looked at her. I didn't lean forward. I didn't soften. I stayed exactly where I was. She continued, filling the quiet with explanations that didn't ask to be challenged. She said things had gotten out of control. She said people had taken sides without understanding. She said she felt punished for being honest about needing space. Each sentence reached toward me, searching for resistance. There was none. When she finally stopped, she waited. The pause stretched longer than she expected. Her breathing changed first, then her posture. She repeated my name once, carefully, like it might still unlock something. I answered with fewer words than she was prepared for. I said she had been clear about not needing my say in her life. I said I had listened. I said I had adjusted accordingly. That was it. She blinked, recalculating. She tried again, this time softer. She said she hadn't meant it like that. She said she assumed I would push back. She said she thought I would fight. I didn't. The realization landed slowly. Not dramatic. Just heavy. She looked around the room as if noticing it for the first time, the way everything had shifted without breaking. She asked if this was permanent. I didn't answer that either. She stood and walked a few steps, then turned back, frustration leaking through the control. She said it wasn't fair to disappear like this. She said relationships didn't work without communication. She said she was trying now. I stayed seated. I said nothing. The silence did what words couldn't. It removed her leverage. There was no argument to win, no emotion to redirect, no reaction to manage. She was standing alone in a conversation that required two, and she finally understood she couldn't pull me back into it. Her shoulders dropped, not in surrender, in uncertainty. She left the room without closing the door. I returned to my work, not because it mattered more, but because it was where I was going anyway. Behind me, the house absorbed the moment quietly, the way it had learned to. She wanted answers. I had already given her the only one she was getting. The collapse didn't announce itself. It unfolded in fragments she couldn't gather fast enough. It started with Evan. His name resurfaced briefly, not in her voice, but on her screen. Missed calls. A late message she reread twice before putting the phone down. When she tried to return it, the call went to voicemail. Later, she learned through someone else that his situation had shifted again. Investors pulled back. A partner stepped away. The confidence that once filled rooms had nowhere left to stand. Laura's calendar emptied unevenly. Some commitments vanished overnight. Others stayed but changed tone. She was no longer asked to lead. She was asked to support, to assist, to wait. At one meeting, she arrived early and left unnoticed. At another, she spoke and realized no one was taking notes. At home, she moved carefully, as if sound itself might push something further away. She stopped trying to draw me into conversation. Instead, she hovered nearby, hoping proximity alone might reset the balance. It didn't. One afternoon, I came home to find boxes in the hallway. Not packed, just opened. Old things. Programs from events. Branded gifts. Photos she had once curated for effect and now sorted with urgency. She sat on the floor surrounded by evidence of a life that had depended on being seen. She picked up a photo from years ago, one where we stood together at a job site opening. I remembered that day. The wind. The dust. Her heels sinking slightly into the gravel. I'd held her elbow without thinking. She stared at the image longer than necessary, then set it face down. Her phone buzzed. She checked it and didn't respond. Another buzz followed. She silenced it this time. Later, she went out and came back before dark. Her makeup was untouched. Her eyes weren't. She passed me in the hallway and stopped, as if expecting me to speak. I didn't. That night, she cried quietly behind a closed door. Not for long, just enough to register. The house held the sound and let it go. The next morning, she didn't get dressed for work. She sat at the table staring at nothing, fingers tracing the grain in the wood. The structure she'd relied on had failed in sequence. First attention, then support, then the assumption that I would be there to absorb the impact. I wasn't. By evening, she understood what had actually been holding everything together. Not the noise, not the rooms, not the freedom she'd performed for others. It had been the quiet consistency she stepped away from first. And now, there was nothing left to catch her. The last moment didn't look like a reconciliation or a goodbye. It looked like an adjustment. She approached me one morning while I was getting ready to leave, already dressed, keys in my hand. She didn't block the doorway. She didn't raise her voice. She stood to the side, careful not to force anything. That alone told me how far things had fallen. She said she finally understood what she had done. Not in theory, not as a lesson, in sequence. She said she had mistaken attention for security and noise for strength. She said she thought I would always be there, steady and silent, no matter what direction she leaned. I didn't interrupt. She said she wasn't asking me to fix anything. She said she just needed to know where we stood. I looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not with regret, with distance that had settled into place and held. I told her I hadn't disappeared. I told her I had simply stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. I said that nothing could go back to how it had been, because how it had been depended on me carrying weight she never acknowledged. She nodded slowly. as if confirming something she'd already felt but avoided naming. Her hands were empty. No phone, no notes, no performance. She asked if there was anything left. I told her there could be, but not on the terms she was used to. I told her there would be no managing appearances, no testing boundaries, no assumption that I would absorb consequences meant for someone else. I said if we moved forward, it would be slower, quieter, and conditional on something she'd never had to prove before. Consistency. She didn't argue. She didn't bargain. She just listened. When she spoke again, it was softer, stripped of timing and strategy. She said she was willing to try. I didn't promise anything. I left the house and went about my day as planned. Meetings, calls, work that didn't care about personal collapse. When I returned that evening, the house felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just still. She had cooked. She hadn't announced it. She hadn't waited in the doorway. She'd left space. I sat down across from her. Not beside her. Across. Nothing was resolved. Nothing was guaranteed. But the rules were finally clear. I hadn't won anything. I had kept myself. And if she stayed, it would be because she chose to meet me there, not because I stayed where she left me. Been through it. When they crossed a line, and you made sure they felt it.